"Merry Christmas, Dad," said the twin girls to the millionaire as they handed him an envelope. When he opened it and read what was inside, he fainted with emotion. Snowflakes danced softly under the twinkling lights of Regent Street. It was Christmas Eve, but for Charles Hartman it was just another day. The 55-year-old millionaire walked briskly, his Armani coat standing in sharp contrast to the festive joy around him. Another hotel, more profit, he thought, glued to his phone. His sharp voice cut through the cold night. "I don't care if it's Christmas. Close the deal now." While he negotiated millions, he barely noticed two small figures approaching him. They were two girls, no older than 9, identical as 2 drops of water. Their brown hair framed pale faces, and their large blue eyes sparkled with a mixture of hope and fear. "Merry Christmas, Dad," they said in unison, extending a simple envelope. Charles, still engrossed in his call, took the envelope automatically. His brain vaguely registered the words "Dad" and "Christmas," but he dismissed them as just another plea for money. London was full of those this time of year. "Look, I have to go. I need to deal with some beggars," he muttered into the phone, slipping it into his pocket. It was then that his eyes truly focused on the girls. For a fleeting moment, something in their gaze unsettled him. There was an uncanny familiarity there, like a distant echo of something he couldn't name. "What do you want?" he asked gruffly, his hand already searching for some loose change in his pocket. But the girls had already disappeared, swallowed by the festive crowd. Charles stood still, confused, the envelope forgotten in his gloved hand. For a moment, he felt an odd sense of loss, as if something precious had slipped through his fingers. Shaking his head to dismiss these inconvenient thoughts, Charles tucked the envelope into the inner pocket of his coat. "Probably just another letter asking for donations," he muttered to himself, resuming his walk. Christmas lights twinkled cheerfully, families laughed and sang, and the aroma of roasted chestnuts filled the air. But for Charles Hartman, it was just another obstacle on his way to the office. After all, he had an empire to manage. There was no time for Christmas sentimentality or strange encounters with street children. As he walked away, he didn't notice the sad eyes following him. Sophie and Clara, the twins he didn't know he had, watched their father disappear into the crowd. They hugged each other, seeking comfort in one another. "He'll read it, won't he?" Sophie asked, her voice trembling slightly. Clara squeezed her sister's hand. "He will. Mum said he has a good heart, remember? We just need to have faith." The girls turned and walked in the opposite direction, their small figures soon lost among the hurried legs of the crowd. The fate of 3 lives had just intersected, and none of them had any idea how that brief encounter would change everything. Charles arrived at his office, the penthouse of one of London's most imposing skyscrapers. He threw his coat over a leather armchair, the envelope falling unnoticed to the floor. Pouring himself an expensive whiskey, he stared out at the illuminated city below. Another Christmas alone, he thought, a bitter smile on his lips. But wasn't this how he liked it? No complications, no distractions, just him and his ever-expanding empire. Still, as the night wore on and snow continued to fall softly outside, Charles found his thoughts drifting to those girls. There was something in their eyes, something that disturbed him in a way he couldn't explain. Shaking his head to clear these thoughts, he turned back to his desk, ready for a few more hours of work. After all, empires don't build themselves, especially not on Christmas Eve. What Charles didn't know was that lying on the floor of his office, a simple envelope contained words that were about to turn his world upside down. The truth waited patiently to be discovered, like a long-forgotten Christmas gift ready to be unwrapped. The clock on the wall of his luxurious office struck 11:45 p.m. Charles Hartman, exhausted after hours poring over contracts and spreadsheets, finally leaned back in his Italian leather chair. His eyes burned, but a smile of satisfaction played on his lips. Another deal closed, another few million added to his fortune. He stood, stretching his aching muscles, and walked to the panoramic window. London sparkled below, a tapestry of Christmas lights and dreams. For a fleeting moment, he felt a pang of... what? Loneliness. Regret. He shook his head, dismissing such inconvenient thoughts. That's when his eyes caught something out of place. A white envelope, simple and unassuming, lay near the armchair where he'd tossed his coat hours earlier. The memory of his encounter with the two girls on Regent Street flashed in his mind. Intrigued, Charles bent down to pick up the envelope. It bore no name, just a delicate snowflake drawn in the corner. With hesitant fingers, he opened it and pulled out a carefully folded sheet of paper. The handwriting was elegant, feminine. Charles began to read, his expression changing with each line. "Dear Charles, if you're reading this, it means our daughters found the courage to give you this letter. Yes, you read that right, our daughters. My name is Emma Dawson. We met 10 years ago at the opening gala for your 10th hotel. I was a waitress. You were the most powerful man in the room. Our eyes met, and for one night, we forgot who we were. I never expected anything from that night, Charles. It was a moment of magic amidst our very different lives, but fate had other plans. 2 weeks later, I found out I was pregnant, with twins. I didn't come to you. I knew that a man in your position didn't need complications. I decided to raise our daughters on my own, with all the love I could give them. Sophie and Clara are the light of my life, Charles, and they have your eyes. If this letter has reached you, it's because I'm no longer here. The illness consuming me won't leave me much more time. My last wish is for our daughters to have a chance to know their father. I ask for nothing more than a look, Charles, a moment for you to see what I see every day. 2 extraordinary girls, intelligent and full of love to give. They are the best of both of us. I know it's a lot to take in. I know it can change your life. But I believe deep in my heart that you have kindness within you. I saw it that night all those years ago. The girls are staying with Mrs. Harris, a kind soul who promised to care for them. You can find them at Café Lumière on Baker Street every day at 3 p.m. They'll wait there until New Year's. The rest, Charles, is in your hands. Whatever your decision, know that I hold no resentment. That one night gave me the greatest gift I've ever received. With love and hope, Emma." The letter slipped from Charles's trembling hands. The world around him seemed to spin, Emma's words echoing in his mind like a whirlwind. Daughters. He had daughters, 2 girls, 10 years old, whom he never knew existed. Flashes of the night Emma mentioned flooded his memory. The gala, the freely flowing champagne, the shy smile of the beautiful waitress. How could he have forgotten? His heart pounded erratically. Charles staggered to his desk, gripping its edge to steady himself. The reality of what he had just discovered hit him like a freight train. Sophie and Clara, he murmured, the names unfamiliar on his tongue. His daughters who had been living on the streets of London while he amassed millions in his bank accounts. Guilt engulfed him like a tidal wave. How could he have been so blind, so absorbed in his own greed that he didn't notice 2 lives depending on him? The tears he had kept at bay for so long finally broke through. Charles Hartman, the ruthless hotel magnate, fell to his knees, sobbing like a child. "Emma," he whispered through his tears. "Forgive me. Please, forgive me." The weight of a decade of absence, of missed moments, of uncelebrated birthdays, crushed him. Charles felt like he was suffocating. With a final shuddering breath, the world around him went dark, and he collapsed on the floor of his luxurious office. When Charles finally regained consciousness, the cold light of Christmas morning filtered through the windows. Slowly, he rose to his feet, his head pounding, the events of the night before returning in painful flashes. The letter, the girls, his daughters. With a jolt, Charles checked the clock, 10:23 a.m. Panic surged through him. The girls, they might already be waiting at the cafe. Ignoring his disheveled appearance, Charles grabbed his coat and bolted to the elevator. As he descended the 50 floors, his mind raced with questions and emotions. What would they be like? What would they say? How could he explain 10 years of absence? When the elevator doors opened, Charles ran to the street, ignoring the surprised looks of the few employees working on Christmas morning. No taxis were in sight. Without a second thought, he started running toward Baker Street, his heart pounding in sync with his desperate footsteps. When he finally reached Café Lumière, Charles stopped, gasping for air. Through the window he could see empty tables, The cafe was closed for the holiday. "No, no, no," he murmured, the desperation rising in his chest. He looked around frantically, searching for two familiar faces in the nearly deserted street, but Sophie and Clara weren't there. His daughters, his family, had disappeared into the vastness of London. Charles sank to his knees on the cold pavement, tears streaming down his face. He had missed his chance. The opportunity to meet his daughters, to make things right, had slipped through his fingers like fine sand. "I will find them," he vowed aloud, to himself and to the universe. "No matter what it takes, I will find my daughters." With that promise echoing in his heart, Charles stood. His world had been turned upside down in a matter of hours, but one thing was certain: nothing would ever be the same. The search for Sophie and Clara began now, and he would not rest until they were in his arms. The clock at the nearby church struck 11 on Christmas morning. For Charles Hartman, it was the beginning of a new life, a journey of redemption and love he never imagined he'd embark on. The days following Christmas were a blur of frantic activity for Charles. The man who once cared only about acquisitions and profits now had a single obsession: finding his daughters. Early the next morning, Charles called an emergency meeting with his executive team. Perplexed faces stared at him as he, with deep circles under his eyes and a disheveled appearance, announced, "Ladies and gentlemen, from this moment on, all projects are on hold. We have a new priority." Ignoring the murmurs of protest, Charles continued, "Two girls, twins, 10 years old. Names Sophie and Clara. Finding them is our only mission now." Antoine, his personal assistant for over a decade, dared to ask, "Mr. Hartman, may I ask why?" Charles interrupted him, his voice choked with emotion. "They are my daughters, Antoine. Daughters I didn't know existed until yesterday." The silence that followed was deafening. Wasting no time, Charles hired the best detective agencies in London. Teams were dispatched to comb through every alley, every square, every shelter in the city. Posters bearing the girls' names and a substantial reward were plastered throughout London. But Charles couldn't sit idly by waiting for results. Each morning he walked the streets himself, searching for hours, his eyes scanning every child's face he passed. His heart leapt at every pair of girls he saw, only to sink again when they weren't Sophie and Clara. The guilt gnawed at him with every street child he encountered, imagining his daughters cold and hungry while he had lived in luxury. After a week of fruitless searching, Charles decided to focus on finding Mrs. Harris, the woman mentioned in Emma's letter. Perhaps she could provide a lead. It was during this search that Charles made a devastating discovery. While visiting the public hospital referenced in the letter, an elderly nurse recognized him from the posters. "Oh, sir, you're looking for Emma Dawson's daughters, aren't you?" she asked, her eyes filled with sympathy. Charles's heart raced. "Yes. Do you know them? Do you know where I can find them?" The nurse sighed heavily. "I'm so sorry, sir. Emma, she passed away 6 months ago. Leukemia. She fought bravely, but..." Charles felt as though the ground had disappeared beneath him. Emma was gone. Gone for months, and he hadn't even known of her existence. And the girls?" he managed to ask, his voice barely above a whisper. "They visited their mother every day," the nurse said. "They were so brave, those little ones." After Emma passed, an elderly lady took them. Mrs. Harris, I believe her name was. Charles clung to this information like a drowning man to a piece of driftwood. "Do you know where I can find this Mrs. Harris?" The nurse shook her head sadly. "I'm sorry, sir. She never left an address. She said she needed to protect the girls." Protect. The word echoed in Charles's mind. Protect them from what? From him? Leaving the hospital, Charles sat on a nearby bench, his head in his hands. The reality of the situation hit him with full force. Emma was gone. His daughters were alone in the world, likely frightened and confused, and he, their father, was a complete stranger to them. At that moment, Charles Hartman made a silent vow. No matter how long it took, no matter the cost, he would find Sophie and Clara. And when he did, he would dedicate every remaining moment of his life to being the father they deserved. With renewed determination, Charles returned to the streets. Now, in addition to searching for the girls, he sought Mrs. Harris. He visited shelters, community centers, churches. He showed their picture to anyone who would look. The nights were the hardest. Lying in his king-sized bed, Charles couldn't sleep, tormented by thoughts of where his daughters might be. Were they cold, hungry? The guilt consumed him, robbing him of rest and appetite. Weeks passed. Charles's hotel empire began to feel the effects of his absence. Shareholders called, demanding explanations, but Charles barely registered their concerns. What were a few £1,000,000 compared to the lives of his daughters? One night, exhausted after another fruitless day of searching, Charles returned to his apartment. Upon entering, he noticed something different. A small white envelope, identical to the one the girls had given him on Christmas Eve, lay on the coffee table. With trembling hands, Charles opened the envelope. Inside was a simple note. "They are safe. When the time is right, you will find them. Have faith." There was no signature, but Charles knew. It was from Mrs. Harris. Tears of relief and frustration ran down his face. His daughters were alive, they were safe, but they were still out of reach. Looking out the window at the city that now seemed to hide his greatest treasures, Charles made a new promise. "I'll wait," he whispered. "I'll become the man, the father you deserve. And when the time comes, I'll be ready." With this resolution, Charles Hartman began a new phase of his journey. A journey not just to find his daughters, but to find himself. To become the man Emma had seen that night, so many years ago. The man Sophie and Clara could proudly call their father. The search continued, but now with a new perspective. Charles knew that wherever they were, his daughters were being cared for, and he would use every moment until they were reunited to prepare for the day he could finally hold them and say, "Dad is here." Charles's once impressive office, formerly a shrine to his business ambitions, now looked more like a command center for a personal quest. Maps of London covered the walls, dotted with colorful pins and connecting lines. On his mahogany desk, stacks of files replaced the usual financial reports. Charles Dubai, unshaven and with dark circles under his eyes, pored over employee records from one of his hotels from a decade ago. His eyes burned, but he refused to stop. Each page he turned might contain the key to finding his daughters. "Emma Dawson," he murmured, running his finger down the list of names. After hours of searching, he finally found her. "Here." Antoine, his loyal assistant, rushed over. "What did you find, sir?" "Emma worked here for just 8 months, Charles said, his voice a mix of excitement and sorrow. From March to November 10 years ago, she resigned a month after the gala, a month after the night their daughters were conceived." Charles felt a lump in his throat. "Is there an address or contact information?" Antoine asked. Charles shook his head. "Nothing current, just the address from that time. Wait." His eyes caught a notation in the corner of the file. "Previous employer reference, Rosewood Bakery." "The bakery?" Antoine asked, surprised. "Yes, on Elm Street. Does it still exist?" Charles was already reaching for his coat. Antoine nodded. "I believe so, sir. But it's past 10 p.m. Perhaps we should wait until morning." But Charles was already heading for the door. "There's no time to wait, Antoine. Every minute counts." The London night was cold, but Charles barely felt it. His heart raced as his car sped through the narrow streets of the city. When they pulled up in front of the small bakery, the lights were still on. A bell jingled as Charles entered. The aroma of freshly baked bread filled the air, stirring unexpected emotions. Did his daughters like bread? What flavors did they prefer? An elderly woman with kind eyes and a name tag that read Mrs. Fletcher appeared from the back. "I'm sorry, sir, but we're closing." "Please," Charles interrupted, his voice thick with emotion. "I need information about a former employee, Emma Dawson. It's urgent." The woman's expression softened instantly. Her eyes widened in recognition. You're the father of her girls, aren't you?" Charles's heart nearly stopped. "You know them. Please, tell me where they are." Mrs. Fletcher gestured to a table. "Sit down, sir. This is a long story." Over the next few minutes, which felt like hours to Charles, Mrs. Fletcher recounted what she knew. Emma had worked at the bakery for years before moving on to the hotel. Even after leaving, she had continued visiting. Emma was special, Mrs. Fletcher said, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. When she found out she was pregnant, we all supported her. And those girls, they're angels. Charles hung on her every word. Have you seen them recently? Mrs. Fletcher hesitated. They used to come here after school to pick up the leftover bread. Emma didn't want charity, you see. But for the girls, I always saved something extra. Guilt hit Charles like a punch to the gut. His daughters, depending on day-old bread while he dined in Michelin-starred restaurants. When was the last time you saw them? He asked, trying to keep his voice steady. About 2 months ago, Mrs. Fletcher replied. After she passed, they didn't come as often. But there's something you need to know. She stood and went to the counter, returning with a small envelope. Sophie left this the last time she was here. She said it was for the man in the suit who would come looking for them. With trembling hands, Charles opened the envelope. Inside was a drawing. 2 girls held hands with a tall figure. Above it, in childlike handwriting, were the words, "Our family one day." Tears streamed down Charles's face. His daughters didn't hate him. They were waiting for him. There's one more thing, Mrs. Fletcher added softly. The girls mentioned a park, Greenhaven Park. They said it was their mother's favorite place. Charles stood abruptly. I need to go there right now. Mrs. Fletcher grabbed his arm. Sir, it's nearly midnight. The girls wouldn't be there at this hour. Besides, she hesitated. Besides, Charles urged, they're with someone. An elderly lady, Mrs. Harris, I believe. Harris, Charles repeated, remembering Emma's letter. Mrs. Fletcher nodded. She seems to be taking good care of them, but she's cautious, protective. Charles absorbed this information, his heart torn between gratitude that his daughters were being cared for and frustration that they were still out of his reach. Thank you, he said finally, shaking Mrs. Fletcher's hand. You have no idea what this means to me. As he left the bakery, Charles felt as though a weight had been lifted. For the first time in weeks, he had real hope. Back in the car, he stared at the drawing. His daughters envisioned him as part of their lives. They wanted him. Greenhaven Park, he murmured to himself. Tomorrow. That night, for the first time since receiving Emma's letter, Charles slept deeply. In his dreams, he walked hand in hand with 2 smiling girls through a sunlit park. The next day would bring new challenges, new searches. But now Charles had something he didn't have before, the certainty that, somewhere in London, 2 girls were waiting for him, and he would move heaven and earth to find them. The sun had barely risen when Charles left his luxurious apartment in Mayfair. Dressed in simple jeans and a worn jacket, clothes he would never have worn under normal circumstances, he blended into the crowd of early commuters flooding the London Underground. His destination, a modest neighbourhood on the outskirts of the city, far from the glamour of central London. A place he hadn't known existed until recently. Emerging from the subway station, Charles was greeted by a scene starkly different from his usual surroundings. Worn-down buildings stood against a grey sky. On cracked sidewalks, people rushed by, burdened with the weight of hard lives etched into their slouched shoulders. Charles felt a knot tighten in his stomach. Was this where his daughters had grown up? In this world of shadows and daily struggles? Following the directions he had received at the bakery, Charles made his way to a small park at the heart of the neighbourhood. Wooden benches surrounded a fountain that hadn't spouted water in years. On one of these benches sat a solitary figure. An elderly woman, her white hair tied in a simple bun, was feeding pigeons with bits of bread. There was a quiet dignity in her posture that drew Charles closer. "Excuse me," he said gently. "Are you Mrs. Harris?" The woman looked up, her deep blue eyes piercing through Charles. For a moment she was silent, as if appraising him. "That depends on who's asking," she finally replied, her voice surprisingly firm for someone her age. Charles hesitated. How could he explain who he was? How could he tell her he was searching for daughters he had never known? I'm Sophie and Clara's father," he said at last, his voice trembling slightly. Mrs. Harris showed no surprise. Instead, A small, knowing smile crossed her lips. "I wondered how long it would take you to find us, Charles Hartman." Charles's heart skipped a beat. "So you know who I am? You know where my daughters are?" Mrs. Harris shrugged, returning her attention to the pigeons. "Knowing where they are and telling you are two very different things, sir." Frustration welled up inside Charles. "Please, I need to see them. They're my daughters." "Are they?" Mrs. Harris asked, her eyes once again locking onto his. "And where were you for the last 10 years, Charles Hartman?" The question hit Charles like a punch to the gut. I didn't know," he murmured. If you had, what?" Mrs. Harris interrupted. "Would you have walked away from your life of luxury to raise 2 little girls? Would you have traded 5-star dinners for sleepless nights with crying babies?" Charles opened his mouth to protest, but no words came. What would he have done, really? Seeing his hesitation, Mrs. Harris softened slightly. "Come, walk with me. There's something you need to see." For the next several minutes, which felt like hours to Charles, Mrs. Harris led him through the streets of the neighborhood. She pointed out alleys where children slept in cardboard boxes, lines stretching outside soup kitchens, and schools with broken windows and graffiti-covered walls. "This is your daughter's world, Charles," Mrs. Harris said softly. "A world where every meal is a victory, where every new pair of shoes is a luxury." Charles felt his heart break with every new scene. How could he have lived in such abundance while his daughters faced so much scarcity? "Emma did her best," Mrs. Harris continued. "She worked 2, sometimes 3 jobs. But even then, many nights, she went to bed hungry so the girls could eat." Silent tears streamed down Charles's face. "I could have helped," he whispered. "If only I had known." Mrs. Harris stopped, turning to face him. "And now that you know, what do you intend to do, Charles Hartman? Are you going to rip the girls out of this world they know? Take them to your ivory tower and expect them to forget all of this?" The question caught Charles off guard. Wasn't that exactly what he had planned to do? I just want to give them a better life," he said, his voice uncertain. "And what is a better life, Charles? Money, expensive toys, or is it love, community, roots?" Mrs. Harris sighed, her gaze softening. "Your daughters are extraordinary, Charles. Intelligent, compassionate, strong. Sophie helps at the soup kitchen every Sunday. Clara teaches younger children how to read. They are the heart of this neighborhood." Charles stood in silence, absorbing her words. His daughters weren't helpless victims waiting to be rescued. They were young women making a difference in their world. "What should I do?" he finally asked, his voice barely a whisper. Mrs. Harris smiled, a genuine smile this time. "First, learn. Learn about their world, their struggles, and their joys. And then when you're ready, when you can see beyond your privilege, perhaps then you'll be ready to be their father." "How long will that take?" Charles asked, desperate. "As long as it takes," Mrs. Harris replied simply. "The girls waited 10 years. They can wait a little longer to have the father they deserve." With those words, Mrs. Harris began to walk away. Charles, desperate, called out, "Wait, when can I see them?" Mrs. Harris paused, glancing over her shoulder. "Come back tomorrow. Same place, same time. And Charles, bring food for the community breakfast. There are many mouths to feed here." As he watched Mrs. Harris disappear into the narrow streets, Charles felt a mix of emotions. Frustration that he still couldn't see his daughters, shame for his ignorance of their world, but also, for the first time, a sense of purpose. He had so much to learn, so much to change. But for Sophie and Clara, for Emma, he would do whatever it took. Walking back to the station, Charles began planning his next steps. Tomorrow he would return. With food, yes, but also with open eyes and an open heart. This neighborhood, full of shadows, had given him his first and most important lesson. To be a true father, he would first need to become a better man. The sun had not yet risen when Charles arrived at the park, his arms full of bags containing fresh bread, fruit and milk. In the past few weeks, he had become a constant presence in the neighborhood, helping with community breakfasts, patching leaking roofs, and even tutoring children in math after school. Mrs. Harris watched his dedication with a mix of approval and caution. On this chilly February morning, She waited for him on the usual bench, her face more serious than usual. "Good morning, Mrs. Harris," Charles greeted, placing the bags on the ground. "I brought fresh croissants today. The children love them." "Charles," Mrs. Harris interrupted him gently, "today is the day." Charles's heart skipped a beat. "You mean," Mrs. Harris nodded, "they're ready to meet you. And you've made more progress than I expected." Charles felt his legs weaken. After weeks of waiting, learning, and changing, the moment had finally arrived. "Where are they?" he asked, barely able to contain the emotion in his voice. Mrs. Harris pointed to a small apartment on the other side of the park. "There, apartment 3B. "But Charles," she held his arm, her gaze intense. "Go gently. They're nervous, and there's something you need to know." But Charles was already crossing the park, his heart pounding so hard it drowned out Mrs. Harris's final words. In seconds, he stood before the door of 3B, his hand trembling as he knocked. For a moment, there was silence. Then, light footsteps. The door opened slowly. Two identical girls stood before him, their large blue eyes, the same as his, wide with apprehension. Charles felt the air leave his lungs. There they were, his daughters, so much like Emma, yet with undeniable traces of him. "Hello," he managed to say, his voice thick with emotion. We know who you are," said the girl on the left, her voice surprisingly firm. "You're Charles Hartman, our dad." The other girl remained silent, half hidden behind her sister. Charles noticed she looked pale, almost frail. "Sophie? Clara?" he asked softly, unsure of who was who. "I'm Sophie," said the girl who had spoken. "This is Clara." Clara gave a small nod but didn't move from behind her sister. May I come in?" Charles asked, feeling strangely shy in front of his own daughters. Sophie hesitated for a moment, then opened the door wider. "I suppose so. Mrs. Harris said you'd come." The apartment was small but surprisingly cozy. Colorful drawings adorned the walls, and Charles recognized the style from the picture Sophie had left at the bakery. "Please, sit," Charles said, gesturing to the small couch. The girls complied, still watching him cautiously. An uncomfortable silence filled the air. Charles opened his mouth several times, but the words seemed to escape him. How could he explain 10 years of absence? How could he ask for forgiveness for something he hadn't known he needed to apologize for? It was Clara who finally broke the silence, her voice low and raspy. "Why didn't you ever look for us before?" The question hit Charles like a punch. I didn't know," he said, his voice trembling. "I swear I didn't know about you." If you had what?" Sophie interrupted, her voice heavy with restrained emotion. "Would you have left your perfect life for us?" Tears welled up in Charles's eyes. "Yes," he said firmly. "Yes, I would have. You are my daughters. Nothing is more important to me than you." Clara coughed, a harsh sound that seemed to rattle her small body. Charles noticed how fragile she looked, her cheeks unnaturally flushed. "Clara's been sick," Sophie explained, noticing the concern in Charles's eyes. "She's been like this for days." Charles instinctively moved closer, extending a hand to touch Clara's forehead. To his surprise, she didn't pull away. "You're burning up," he murmured, panic rising in his chest. "We need to get you to a doctor." Sophie shook her head. "We don't have money for doctors. Besides, Clara hates hospitals. Our mum—" She stopped, swallowing hard. Charles understood. The hospital was where Emma had spent her last days. "I understand," Charles said gently. "But Clara needs care. I know a doctor, a friend. He can come here if you prefer." The girls exchanged a glance, having a silent conversation Charles couldn't decipher. Finally, Sophie nodded. "Okay," she said, "but we both stay with her the whole time." Charles smiled, feeling a surge of pride at Sophie's fierce protectiveness. "Of course. I'll call him right now." As Charles spoke to his friend on the phone, explaining the situation, he observed his daughters. Sophie whispered comforting words to Clara, tucking a stray strand of hair behind her sister's ear, with a gesture so full of love it made Charles' heart ache. When he hung up, Charles approached again. "Doctor, Martin will be here in 20 minutes, he informed them. He's the best pediatrician in London. Sophie nodded, still wary but visibly relieved. Clara simply closed her eyes, leaning against her sister's shoulder. "Thank you," Sophie murmured, her voice barely audible. Charles sat in the armchair opposite the couch, watching his daughters. There was so much he wanted to say, so many questions he wanted to ask. But now wasn't the time. The only thing that mattered was ensuring Clara's health. As they waited for the doctor, Charles allowed himself to dream of the future, a future where he could make up for all the lost years, a future where Sophie wouldn't have to carry the weight of the world on her small shoulders, a future where Clara could smile without the shadow of illness. It would be a long and difficult journey, he knew. Winning his daughter's trust wouldn't happen overnight. But looking at Sophie and Clara, Charles knew he would do anything, face any challenge, to be the father they deserved. The sound of the doorbell announced Dr. Martin's arrival. As Charles rose to answer, he made a silent vow to his daughters, to Emma, and to himself. From that moment on, nothing would matter more than the health and happiness of Sophie and Clara. The true challenge of fatherhood was just beginning. The steady beeping of the heart monitor filled the quiet hospital room. Charles sat by Clara's bedside, his heart heavy as he watched her small figure curled up under the crisp white sheets. Dr. Martin's diagnosis had been clear: severe pneumonia requiring immediate hospitalization. Sophie sat next to her sister, holding Clara's hand tightly. Her eyes were red from crying, but she kept a brave face. Charles admired her strength, his eldest by just 7 minutes, as Sophie had proudly told him earlier. "Will she be okay?" Sophie asked, her voice trembling but resolute. Charles placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. To his surprise, she didn't shrug it off. "She'll be fine," he replied, trying to sound confident. "Clara is getting the best care possible. Dr. Martin is the best pediatrician in London." Sophie nodded, though Charles could see the worry still etched on her face. "It started like this with Mum," she whispered. "First a cough, then a fever, and then—" Her voice broke, and Charles felt his heart shatter. Without thinking, he knelt beside Sophie, so their eyes were level. "Sophie, look at me," he said gently. When she did, he continued, "I promise you that I will do everything in my power to make sure Clara gets better. You're not alone anymore." Sophie stared at him for a long moment, her eyes so much like his, filled with a mixture of hope and fear. Then, to his astonishment, she threw herself into his arms, sobbing. Charles held her tightly, tears streaming down his own face. It was the first time he'd held one of his daughters, and the sheer weight of emotion overwhelmed him. He stroked her hair, murmuring words of comfort. After a few minutes, Sophie pulled away, wiping her tears with the back of her hand. "I'm sorry," she mumbled, looking embarrassed. "Don't apologize," Charles said softly. "It's okay to cry. You've been so strong, Sophie. But now, you don't have to carry everything by yourself." Sophie regarded him for a moment before nodding slightly. It was a small gesture, but to Charles, it meant the world. The next few days were a roller coaster of emotions. Clara responded well to the treatment, but she remained weak. Sophie refused to leave her side, sleeping in the hospital chair next to her sister's bed. Charles divided his time between the hospital and practical arrangements. He worked tirelessly to secure temporary custody of the girls with the help of his lawyers. He also began preparing his apartment to welcome his daughters, converting one of the guest rooms into a warm, welcoming space for the twins. Late one night at the hospital, with Clara asleep and Sophie visibly exhausted, Charles finally had a chance to speak with his eldest daughter. "What was life like for you before?" Charles asked hesitantly. Sophie played with the hem of her shirt before answering. "Hard sometimes, but Mum always made it feel like an adventure. She called us the Three Musketeers." Charles smiled wistfully. "She sounds like an incredible mother." "She was," Sophie said, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "She talked about you, you know." Charles's breath caught. "She did," Sophie nodded. "She said you were a good man, but that you didn't know about us. She said one day when we were older, we'd understand." Guilt washed over Charles again. "I'm so sorry I wasn't there," he said, his voice cracking. "If I had known, But you didn't, Sophie interrupted, her voice surprisingly firm. Mum always said we can't judge people without knowing their whole story. Charles looked at his daughter with newfound admiration. Your mother was a very wise woman. Sophie offered a small smile. She was. She also loved to sing. Clara and we miss her lullabies. Charles hesitated before asking, would you like me to sing for you sometime? Sophie looked at him, surprised. You can sing? Terribly, Charles admitted with a sheepish grin, but I'd be willing to try if it would make you happy. To his delight, Sophie laughed, a brief, genuine laugh. Maybe, she said, but I can't promise I won't cover my ears. Over the following days, Charles learned more about his daughters. He discovered Sophie's love for adventure books and her dream of becoming an explorer. Clara, quieter, had a natural talent for drawing and spent hours sketching in a notebook. Slowly, the walls between them began to crumble. Clara, though still recovering, started asking questions about Charles's life. Sophie, though cautious, allowed moments of vulnerability, sharing memories of Emma and their life before. One evening, Clara asked a question that took Charles by surprise. Can we call you Dad? She asked shyly. Charles felt his heart swell. I'd love that, he replied, fighting back tears. But only if you feel ready. There's no rush. Sophie, who was coloring in a book beside Clara's bed, glanced up. Maybe we can start with Charles and see how it goes. Charles nodded, grateful for even the smallest step. That sounds perfect to me. As the days passed, Charles found himself becoming more involved in the daily routines of caring for his daughters. He learned how to braid Clara's hair, after several failed attempts that made the girls laugh uncontrollably. He discovered Sophie's favorite bedtime stories, and even fulfilled his promise to sing them a lullaby, which ended in more laughter and a gentle request for just hugs next time. When the day finally came for Clara to be discharged from the hospital, Charles felt a mix of joy and apprehension. His daughters would finally be coming home to his home, but he knew it would be a major adjustment for everyone. Are you okay? He asked the twins as they packed up their few belongings in the hospital room. Sophie and Clara exchanged glances before Sophie replied, It's just a big change. Charles knelt down to their level. I know it is, and I promise we'll take it at your pace. If anything feels too much, you can tell me. We're learning together, okay? The girls nodded, and Charles saw a spark of hope in their eyes that hadn't been there before. As they left the hospital, Charles holding Clara's hand while Sophie walked beside them, he felt a wave of determination. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be misunderstandings, growing pains, and hard conversations. But looking at his daughters, Charles knew he would face anything for them. These were the first steps of a long journey, a journey of healing, rediscovery, and building a family. And Charles was determined to make every step count. The apartment that had once been a sterile showcase of wealth now bore clear signs of the presence of two 10-year-old girls. Colorful drawings adorned the refrigerator, children's books were scattered on the coffee table, and a pair of bright pink sneakers lay abandoned near the couch. It was a quiet evening, 2 weeks after Clara's return from the hospital. Charles had prepared dinner, still learning his way around the kitchen with mixed results. And now the three of them sat in the living room, the soft hum of the television in the background. Girls, Charles began, hesitating slightly. I was wondering if you'd like to tell me more about what life was like with your mum. Sophie and Clara exchanged a look, their unspoken communication something Charles was still getting used to. It was Clara who spoke first, her voice soft. Mum always made everything magical, even when we didn't have much. Sophie nodded, a small smile on her face. Remember the time the power went out, Clara? Mum turned it into a camping adventure in the living room. Charles listened intently, his heart aching and full at the same time, as the girls shared memories, impromptu picnics in their tiny apartment on rainy days, made-up bedtime stories, and costumes crafted from old clothes for their own living room plays. Did she ever talk about me? Charles asked hesitantly, his voice barely above a whisper. A tense silence followed. Sophie, always the bolder of the two, answered, Sometimes. She said you were a good man but very busy. That one day, we'd understand. Charles felt the weight of guilt grow heavier. "I'm so sorry," he said, his voice breaking, "for not being there." "But you didn't know," Clara said gently. "Mum always said it wasn't your fault. She said we shouldn't judge people without knowing their whole story." Charles looked at his younger daughter with awe. How could someone so young hold such wisdom? "Your mother sounds like she was an amazing woman," Charles said softly. "She was," Sophie affirmed, her tone holding a hint of challenge. "She did everything for us." Charles understood the unspoken accusation. Unlike him, he knew he still had a long way to go to earn their complete trust. "I know I can't ever replace your mum," Charles said carefully, "and I wouldn't want to, but I hope we can build something together." In time, the girls were silent for a moment, processing his words. Finally, Clara spoke. "Charles, why didn't you look for Mum after that night?" The question hit Charles like a blow. How could he explain the mistakes of his past without sounding selfish or uncaring? I was a fool," he admitted, choosing honesty. "I was so focused on building my business that I didn't give your mother or what we had the importance it deserved. It's the greatest regret of my life." Sophie studied him intently. "And now, what's different?" Charles took a deep breath. "Everything. You two changed everything. I realize now that none of what I've achieved means anything if I don't have people I love to share it with. And even though I've only just met you, I love you both more than I ever thought possible." The weight of his words hung in the air. Charles watched as Clara's eyes filled with tears, while Sophie struggled to hold back her own emotions. "How do we know for sure?" Sophie asked, her voice trembling slightly. "How do we know you won't change your mind and leave us?" Charles's heart broke at the fear in his daughter's voice. He knelt before them, meeting their eyes directly. "I promise you, both of you, here and now, that I will never ever leave you. You are my #1 priority, above any business, any meeting, anything. I know words can feel empty right now, but please, give me the chance to prove it with my actions. Every day, year after year, I'm here to stay." The girls stared at him for a long moment, as if searching his eyes for the truth. Then, to his surprise, Clara threw her arms around him, holding him tightly. Sophie hesitated for a moment before joining the embrace. Charles wrapped his arms around both of them, tears streaming down his face. It was a moment of connection he would treasure forever. In the days that followed, Charles devoted himself entirely to proving his promise. He reorganized his entire schedule, prioritizing time with the girls above all else. Meetings were rescheduled, business trips cancelled. Every moment he could spend with Sophie and Clara, he did. He also began the formal process of gaining custody of the twins. Sitting in his office with his lawyer, he was overwhelmed by the complexity of the situation. "This will be a delicate process," the lawyer explained. "Given that you've only recently entered their lives, the court will scrutinize your ability to be their primary guardian." Charles felt a pang of panic. "But they're my daughters. Surely I have rights." "You do," the lawyer reassured him. "But the courts will always prioritize what's in the best interests of the children. We'll need to demonstrate that you can provide a stable, loving environment." Charles nodded, resolute. "I'll do whatever it takes. Parenting classes, psychological evaluations, whatever's necessary. Those girls are my life now." As the legal process unfolded, Charles found himself confronting his own insecurities. Doubts crept in during quiet moments. Would he be enough for them? Could he ever truly make up for the lost years? But then there were moments that reassured him. Clara's smile when he finally perfected a braid in her hair. Sophie's excitement when he surprised her with tickets to an exhibit on explorers at the museum. The shared laughter over a burnt dinner that ended in pizza delivery. Day by day, Charles learned what it meant to be a father. And his daughters, resilient and loving, were giving him the chance to be part of their lives. The journey was far from over. There were still truths to uncover, trust to build. But Charles was committed. For Sophie, for Clara, and for Emma's memory, he would do everything in his power to be the father they deserved. Charles's journey of redemption and love was just beginning. For the first time in his life, he felt he was on the right path. The sound of hammers and drills echoed through the halls of Charles's luxurious apartment building. Wearing jeans and a simple t-shirt, an outfit that would have shocked his business associates. Charles personally oversaw the renovations to his home. "No, not there," he instructed one of the workers, pointing to a wall. "We're knocking this one down to create a bigger play area for the girls." The apartment, once a cold monument to minimalist design, was being transformed into a warm, welcoming space. Walls were painted in vibrant colors, comfortable furniture replaced sleek designer pieces, and an expansive room was being created just for Sophie and Clara. Charles smiled as he watched the progress. Every change in the apartment mirrored the changes in himself. He wasn't just building a physical space, he was creating a home for his daughters. Amid the commotion of the renovation, Charles's phone buzzed. It was the principal of the school where Sophie and Clara had recently been enrolled. "Mr. Hartman," the voice on the other end sounded concerned. "There's been an incident with Sophie today." Charles's heart skipped a beat. "Is she okay? What happened?" "Physically, she's fine," the principal assured him. "But there was an altercation with another student. Apparently, the boy made comments about the situation with her family." Charles closed his eyes, feeling a mix of anger and sadness. He had known the transition to a new school would be difficult, especially with the attention their story had garnered. "I'm on my way," he said, already grabbing his keys. At the school, Charles found Sophie sitting in the principal's office, her face a mask of controlled anger. Clara sat next to her, holding her sister's hand. "Hey, my warriors," Charles said gently, kneeling in front of them. "I heard we had a tough day." Sophie looked up at him, her blue eyes filled with tears she refused to shed. "He said we're charity cases. That you only took us in because you felt sorry for us." Charles felt a surge of rage, but forced himself to stay calm for Sophie's sake. "Sophie, Clara, look at me," he said firmly. "That's not true. You're my daughters, and I love you more than anything in the world. Nothing and no one can change that." Clara, ever the more sensitive of the two, threw herself into Charles's arms, sobbing. Sophie hesitated for a moment before joining the embrace. After a long discussion with the principal about how to address bullying and protect the girls' privacy, Charles took his daughters home. On the way, he made an important phone call. "Mrs. Harris, the girls need you. Can you come to the apartment tonight?" That evening, the apartment, still under renovation, was filled with warmth. Mrs. Harris, with her calming presence, brewed hot chocolate in the kitchen while Charles sat with the girls in the living room. "I know it's been hard," Charles began, looking at Sophie and Clara. "All these changes, the new school, people talking, but I want you to know we're in this together. We're a family." Mrs. Harris entered the room, carrying a tray of steaming mugs. "And family supports each other," she added, sitting beside the girls, "even when some members take a while to find their way back." Charles smiled gratefully at Mrs. Harris. Her steady presence had been a lifeline over the past weeks, providing the girls with a connection to their past as they adjusted to their new life. "But what if," Sophie began hesitantly, "what if people keep saying bad things about us?" Charles exchanged a look with Mrs. Harris before answering, "Then we'll face them together. You are strong, smart, and brave. Don't let anyone make you believe otherwise." And Mrs. Harris added with a mischievous smile, "You now have a secret weapon." The girls looked at her curiously. "What?" "A father who could buy the whole school if he wanted to," Mrs. Harris teased, making everyone laugh. The night continued with stories, laughter, and plans for the future. Charles marveled at how his daughters seemed to relax in Mrs. Harris's presence, sharing details about their day they hadn't yet opened up to him about. Later, when the girls had gone to bed, Charles and Mrs. Harris sat in the living room, talking in hushed tones. "You're doing a good job, Charles," Mrs. Harris said, surprising him. "It's not perfect, but you're trying," Charles sighed. "Sometimes I feel like it's not enough. There's so much to make up for." Mrs. Harris placed a comforting hand on his arm. "The past is the past. What matters is now, and the future you're building with them." Before Charles could respond, his phone buzzed on the table. It was a message from his PR team. The headline of an attached article made his blood run cold. "Lost Heirs, the untold story of Charles Hartman's secret daughters." "Oh no," he murmured, showing the phone to Mrs. Harris. She read the headline quickly, her expression turning serious. It was only a matter of time before the press caught on. Charles ran a hand through his hair, frustrated. How do I protect the girls from this? They're already struggling with the transition at school. Mrs. Harris thought for a moment before speaking. Maybe it's time to take control of the narrative. Tell the story on your own terms before others twist it further. Charles nodded slowly. You're right, but we need to do this in a way that keeps the girls safe. Over the next few days, Charles worked tirelessly with his PR team. They crafted a careful statement that shared the truth without delving into personal details. Charles insisted on being honest about his ignorance of his daughter's existence and took full responsibility for his past. Yet at the same time, he doubled down on efforts to create a stable and loving environment for Sophie and Clara. The renovations to the apartment sped up, and Charles involved the girls in every decision, from wall colors to furniture selection. One afternoon, while painting their new bedroom together, Sophie asked a question that caught Charles off guard. Do you think Mum would be happy with all this? Charles paused. Paintbrush in hand, he thought carefully before responding. I think your mum would be very happy to see you both safe and loved. She did an incredible job raising you, and I hope I can honor her memory by being the best dad I can for you. Clara, who was sticking star decals on the wall, turned to Charles. And we're trying too, she said softly, to be the best daughters we can be. Charles felt his heart swell with emotion. He put down his paintbrush and opened his arms. For the first time, both girls ran into his embrace without hesitation. In that moment, surrounded by the smell of fresh paint and the warmth of his daughter's love, Charles knew they were moving in the right direction. The transformation wasn't just in the apartment, it was in their lives and their bond as a family. While the world outside speculated and judged, within the walls of their home, a new story was unfolding. A story of love, redemption, and second chances. Outside, snow began to fall over London, blanketing the city in white. Inside the Hartman residence, now truly a home, laughter and love filled the air as a family celebrated the miracle of finding each other. But this was just the beginning of their journey together. A week later, Charles's carefully prepared public statement was released. It addressed the rumors surrounding Sophie and Clara while emphasizing his commitment to their well-being. The response was overwhelmingly positive, with the media praising his honesty and responsibility. Sophie and Clara, however, were less interested in the media frenzy than in preparing for their first family Christmas with Charles. They insisted on decorating the tree themselves, turning the task into a day-long adventure filled with laughter, tangled lights, and a tree topper that refused to stay in place. It's crooked, Sophie declared, standing back to inspect their work. Perfectly imperfect, Charles replied with a grin. Just like us. The girls laughed, and Clara added, Can we make hot chocolate now? In the kitchen, as they sipped their drinks and talked about Christmases past, Charles felt a deep sense of gratitude. He'd missed so many moments in their lives, but he was determined to make every moment moving forward count. The holidays brought more milestones. Sophie and Clara joined Charles at a charity event he hosted to support single mothers, a cause he'd embraced in Emma's memory. The girls handed out gifts to children, their smiles lighting up the room. Your daughters are incredible, a guest commented to Charles. They take after their mother, he replied, his voice filled with pride. As the new year approached, Charles reflected on how much had changed. From a lonely businessman to a devoted father, his life had transformed in ways he never imagined. And though the path ahead was still uncertain, he faced it with a newfound sense of purpose. On New Year's Eve, as fireworks lit up the London skyline, Sophie and Clara sat with Charles on the balcony, wrapped in blankets. What's your resolution, Dad? Clara asked. Charles smiled at the word dad and thought for a moment. To be the best father I can be for you both. And to make every day count. Sophie grinned. You're already doing a pretty good job. As the first fireworks of the new year lit up the sky, Charles held his daughters close, knowing that the greatest gifts of his life were right there beside him. The days that followed were filled with new routines and small moments of joy. Charles made it a priority to spend every evening with Sophie and Clara, whether it was helping with homework, playing board games, or simply listening to their stories about school. The apartment renovations were finally completed, and the girls' new bedroom became their favorite space. It was bright and colourful, with a reading nook for Sophie and an art corner for Clara. "It's perfect," Sophie said one evening as she lay on her bed, flipping through a book. "You did a good job, Dad," Clara added, sketching at her desk. Hearing them call him Dad filled Charles with a sense of fulfillment he hadn't known was possible. Every effort he'd made, every change in his life, felt worth it for moments like this. The family settled into a rhythm, but there were still challenges to overcome. Sophie and Clara were slowly adjusting to their new school, but there were moments of hesitation and insecurity. Charles made it a point to be involved, attending parent-teacher meetings and volunteering for school events whenever possible. "Though you don't have to come to everything," Sophie teased one morning as he packed their lunches. "I want to," Charles replied with a grin. "It's important to me." The girls exchanged amused looks but didn't protest. One afternoon, Charles received an unexpected call from Mrs. Harris. Her voice was calm but serious. "Charles, there's something we need to discuss," she said. "It's about Isabel." Charles's stomach sank at the mention of Emma's estranged sister. "What's going on?" "She's been asking around about the girls again," Mrs. Harris explained. "I thought you should know." Isabel had appeared briefly after Emma's death, claiming she wanted to reconnect with the twins. But her interest seemed to stem more from financial motives than genuine care. And she'd quickly disappeared when it became clear that Charles was now in the picture. "Thank you for telling me," Charles said, his voice firm. "I'll make sure the girls are protected." That evening, after the girls had gone to bed, Charles sat with Mrs. Harris in the living room, discussing the best way to handle Isabel's potential interference. "You've built a safe, loving home for them," Mrs. Harris said. "The courts will see that." Charles nodded, determined. No one is going to disrupt their lives. Not now, not ever. Over the next few weeks, Charles worked with his legal team to ensure Sophie and Clara's custody arrangements were ironclad. He also made sure the girls felt secure and loved, never letting them sense the tension he was dealing with behind the scenes. Meanwhile, the bond between Charles and his daughters continued to grow. Clara's health improved steadily, and she began to thrive at school. Sophie, always the more outspoken of the two, became more open with her emotions, trusting Charles in ways she hadn't before. One evening, as they were preparing dinner together, Clara asked, "Do you think Mum would be proud of us?" Charles paused, his heart full. "I know she would," he said softly. "She'd be proud of how brave and kind and amazing you both are." "What about you?" Sophie asked, her tone curious. "Do you think she'd be proud of you?" The question took Charles by surprise. He thought for a moment before replying, "I hope so. I'm trying my best to be the father you deserve, and I'll keep trying every day." Sophie nodded thoughtfully, and Clara smiled. "We think you're doing pretty well," she said, making Charles chuckle. Moments like these reminded Charles of how far they'd come as a family. There was still work to do, but the love and trust they were building gave him hope for the future. As spring approached, Charles began planning a special trip for the girls, a weekend getaway to the countryside. It would be their first vacation as a family, a chance to create new memories together. The girls were thrilled when he told them about the plan. "Can we go hiking?" Sophie asked eagerly. "And can we bring sketchbooks?" Clara added. "We can do whatever you want," Charles replied, smiling at their excitement. "This trip is all about us spending time together." The weekend arrived quickly, and the trip was everything Charles had hoped for. They explored nature trails, roasted marshmallows by a campfire, and spent hours talking under the stars. One night, as they sat by the fire, Sophie turned to Charles. "Do you think Mum would have liked it here?" "I think she would have loved it," Charles said, "and I think she'd be happy knowing we're here together." The girls exchanged a look, their expressions softening. "We're happy, too," Clara said quietly, leaning against Charles's shoulder. As he held his daughters close, Charles felt a deep sense of peace. This was what he'd been searching for, not in business or wealth, but in the simple, profound connection of family. The return from the trip marked a turning point for Charles and the girls. The memories they had created seemed to strengthen the bond between them, bringing a new sense of comfort and trust to their relationship. Clara had started showing Charles her drawings more often, even asking for his opinion on her latest sketches. Sophie, meanwhile, invited him to read one of her favorite books with her, a gesture that felt like a significant step. "You have to do the voices," Sophie insisted as they sat on the couch, the book open on her lap. Charles laughed. "Voices? I'm not sure I'm very good at that." "You'll do fine," Clara encouraged from her drawing spot across the room, a playful smile on her face. Charles did his best, and while his voices weren't quite professional, the sound of the girls' laughter made every attempt worthwhile. These were the moments he cherished most. As weeks turned into months, life began to settle into a new normal. Charles continued to be deeply involved in the girls' lives, attending school events, helping with homework, and making sure their days were filled with warmth and stability. At the same time, his efforts to strengthen their custody arrangement progressed. His legal team assured him that everything was on track, but the lingering possibility of Isabel interfering still weighed on his mind. One day, while they were at a park enjoying a sunny afternoon, Sophie brought up a topic Charles hadn't expected. "Dad," she began hesitantly, "do you think we'll ever see Aunt Isabel again?" Charles looked at her carefully. "How do you feel about that?" he asked. Sophie shrugged. "I don't know. I mean, she's family, right? But she doesn't feel like family." Clara, who had been quiet, added, "She made us feel like a problem, not like people she cared about." Charles felt his heart ache at their honesty. "You two are never a problem," he said firmly. "You're my greatest joy. If Isabel ever comes back into your lives, it'll only be because it's what you want. Your feelings matter most." Both girls seemed reassured by his words. Sophie leaned against him, and Clara held his hand as they continued watching the ducks in the pond. That evening, after the girls were asleep, Charles found himself thinking about what they had said. Isabel had been a shadow in their lives for too long. He resolved to address the situation once and for all. The opportunity came sooner than he expected. A few days later, Isabel reached out to Charles, requesting a meeting. Though wary, Charles agreed, wanting to hear her intentions directly. They met at a quiet cafe, far from the prying eyes of the media. Isabel arrived looking composed, but there was an edge to her demeanor. "Thank you for meeting me," she said, sitting across from him. "What do you want, Isabel?" Charles asked directly, keeping his tone calm but firm. Isabel hesitated, then said, "I made mistakes in the past. I let my pride and anger get in the way of being there for Sophie and Clara. I want to be part of their lives now." Charles studied her carefully, searching for sincerity in her words. "This isn't about money or appearances." Isabel shook her head. "No. I've come to realize that family is what matters most. I'd like to build a relationship with them, but only if it's what they want." Her words felt genuine, but Charles knew trust wouldn't come easily. "If the girls decide they're open to it, I'll support them. But this has to be on their terms." Isabel nodded. "I understand." "Thank you, Charles." When he told Sophie and Clara about the meeting, he was careful to present Isabel's intentions neutrally, letting them decide how they felt. "We'll think about it," Sophie said, after a long pause. "But we're not ready yet," Clara added. "Maybe someday. Just not now." Charles respected their decision and assured them they could take all the time they needed. Isabel's role in their lives, if any, would depend entirely on them. In the meantime, Charles focused on building the life they were creating together. As the summer approached, he planned another trip, this time to the seaside. The girls were thrilled at the idea of playing on the beach and exploring tide pools. "Can we collect shells?" Clara asked excitedly. "And can we build the biggest sand castle ever?" Sophie added. "We'll do it all," Charles promised, smiling at their enthusiasm. The trip was another success, filled with laughter, sun, and memories they would cherish forever. Each moment reinforced the strength of their bond and the joy they found in being a family. On the last night of the trip, as they watched the sunset over the ocean, Clara looked up at Charles and said, "This feels like home." Charles hugged her tightly. "It is home, wherever we are together." The return to their routine felt even more special after the trip. The girls seemed more confident, more secure in their place in Charles's life. One evening, as they prepared for bed, Sophie said, "We're glad you found us." "I'm the lucky one," Charles replied. You've given me more than I ever thought possible." As the lights dimmed and the house fell quiet, Charles sat in the living room, reflecting on how far they had come. There were still challenges ahead, but for the first time in his life he felt truly whole. The journey was far from over, but the love they shared gave him the strength to face whatever lay ahead. Together, they would continue building a future filled with hope, joy, and the unwavering bond of family. As the weeks turned into months, Charles found himself increasingly immersed in the joys and challenges of fatherhood. Every day brought new discoveries, from Sophie's knack for solving puzzles to Clara's passion for baking. One Saturday morning, Charles woke up to the smell of something burning. Rushing to the kitchen, he found Clara standing at the counter, her face smudged with flour, and Sophie fanning a tray of slightly charred cookies. "We were trying to surprise you," Clara explained sheepishly. Charles laughed, pulling them both into a hug. "Surprise achieved, and next time let's try it together." Moments like these were the highlights of Charles's days. He cherished the small, everyday moments that made their bond stronger. Meanwhile, Isabel remained in the background, respecting the girl's decision to take things slowly. She occasionally sent letters and small gifts, which Sophie and Clara appreciated but weren't yet ready to respond to. "She's trying," Sophie admitted one evening, "but I still don't know if I'm ready to let her in." "Take your time," Charles assured her. "You get to decide what feels right for you." As autumn approached, Charles began planning for the upcoming school year. He worked with Sophie and Clara to choose their extracurricular activities, encouraging them to explore their interests. Sophie joined the debate club, where her quick thinking and confidence quickly made her a standout. Clara signed up for an art class, her sketches earning praise from her teacher. "You're amazing," Charles told them after hearing about their achievements. "I'm so proud of you both." The girls beamed, their smiles reflecting the love and support they now felt every day. One evening, while going through old photos with Mrs. Harris, Charles came across a picture of Emma holding the twins as babies. The image brought tears to his eyes. "She'd be so proud of them," Mrs. Harris said softly. "And of you, Charles." "I hope so," Charles replied, his voice thick with emotion. "Everything I do is for them, and for her." As the leaves began to change, the Hartman household prepared for its first Thanksgiving together. Charles decided to host a dinner, inviting Mrs. Harris, close friends, and even Isabel. "Are you sure about inviting her?" Sophie asked, her brow furrowed. "It's up to you," Charles said gently. "If it's too soon, we can wait." After some thought, Sophie and Clara agreed. "She can come," Sophie said, "but we'll see how it goes." Isabel arrived that evening, looking nervous but genuinely happy to be included. She brought a handmade photo album filled with pictures of Emma from their childhood. "I thought the girls might like to see these," Isabel said, handing it to Charles. Sophie and Clara flipped through the album, their expressions softening as they saw glimpses of their mother's life before them. "Thank you," Clara said quietly. "This means a lot." The dinner was filled with warmth and laughter, with everyone sharing stories and reflecting on what they were thankful for. For Charles, the biggest blessing was clear: his daughters. After the guests had left and the house was quiet, Sophie and Clara hugged Charles tightly. "This was the best Thanksgiving ever," Sophie declared. "Because we're a family now," Clara added. Charles kissed the tops of their heads. "Yes, we are. And I'm so grateful for you both." As the year came to an end, the Hartman family found themselves stronger than ever. Their journey had been far from easy, but it was filled with love, growth, and the promise of a bright future. The Christmas season brought even more joy. Charles chose Sophie and Clara, decorated the house together, filling it with lights, ornaments, and the smell of freshly baked cookies. "Let's make this a tradition," Clara suggested as they hung the final ornament on the tree. "A new tradition for our new family," Charles agreed, his heart full. On Christmas morning, the girls woke to find the living room filled with gifts. But the most meaningful one wasn't under the tree. It was a framed picture of Emma with the twins as babies, placed prominently on the mantel. "So we'll always remember her," Charles explained when they saw it. Sophie and Clara hugged him tightly, their gratitude unspoken but deeply felt. As the snow fell softly outside, Charles sat by the fire with his daughters. reflecting on how far they had come. They had built something beautiful from the pain of the past, a family rooted in love and resilience. "We're home now," Clara whispered, resting her head on Charles's shoulder. "Yes, we are," Charles replied, holding her close. "And we always will be." That evening, as they watched the lights of the Christmas tree twinkle, Charles felt a deep sense of peace. This was what he had been searching for all along: family, connection, love. The journey wasn't over, but they were ready to face it together. And no matter what the future held, Charles knew one thing for certain: he would always be there for Sophie and Clara. As the clock struck midnight, marking the start of a new year, the three of them shared a quiet, heartfelt moment. "Happy New Year," Sophie said softly, her voice filled with hope. Charles smiled. "Happy New Year, my loves,"